Has anyone here played the game Guess Who? Anybody? That doesn't look like very many people. Has anybody played that? The game where you have all the characters on it and the person has the same characters on the other side or something like that, and you have to ask a series of questions and finally guess who the person is. And it's interesting when you look into the game, there are strategies that some people have deployed with it to basically win every time, because if you ask certain questions, you narrow down the field extremely fast in just a few questions, so that if you're playing somebody who doesn't know these questions, well, then you can always win. The whole point of the game is you got a character, and the other person is trying to guess your character, and you're trying to guess them. Hence, Guess Who. There are many other games that are similar to it, where you have to figure out who the person is by doing some investigative work. And in Genesis, where we've arrived here in chapter 48 and 49, is sort of getting to the question of, guess who? Who's going to get the blessing? We've seen sort of little glimpses of it thus far in Genesis, that this is a question that's sort of being thrown around, is who's going to get the blessing from their father Israel? At one point, it seemed like, well, Reuben's the firstborn out of all the children, so Reuben should get it. At other points, Reuben doesn't seem like the likeliest of characters, and it seems that Judah is going to get it. But then we had this whole event with Joseph's brothers going to Egypt, and then all of a sudden Joseph is back in the picture. So now is Joseph going to get the blessing? Who's going to get it? And a lot of what's been going on in the text has sort of been pointing us into this direction, to where we arrive here in chapter 48, where we're going to see who is the one who gets the blessing. And yet, as we're going through this, the answer to that is not as simple as perhaps we would like it to be. In Genesis chapter 48, in verse 1, it says, "After this, Joseph was told, 'Behold, your father is ill.' So he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And it was told to Jacob, 'Your son Jacob has come to you.' Then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, 'God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you. I will make of you a company of peoples and will give you this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession.' And so Jacob, recalling in his own life how God had passed on the Abrahamic covenant to him, not to his brother Esau, but it went to Jacob, the younger of the two. And so Jacob notes this, verse 5, 'And now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. And the children that you fathered after them shall be yours, and they shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. As for me, when I came from Padan, to my sorrow Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way. And when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem.' And so Jacob, in his conversation to Joseph, he to put it very simply, 'I'm going to steal your two sons from you, and they're now my sons.' It's not exactly what's going on, but in essence, this is how you get to where the tribes are distributed. Why is it that you have the land given out to the tribe of Manasseh and to the tribe of Ephraim when Joseph is the son? So Joseph's sons have a tribal name, but Joseph does not have a tribal name, and it's because his father says to him, 'I'm going to take your two sons as if they are my own,' and they then inherit this blessing as well as the other of his 11 sons, which is why the land is separated in the way that it is, making up the 12 tribes of Israel, Levi not getting a land possession because their possession is the Lord himself through the priesthood. In verse 8, it says, 'When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, Who are these?' So an interesting question, but Jacob at this point is not so bright in the eyes, if you will. He's pretty blind. And so he asks, who are these? Joseph said to his fathers, these are my sons whom God has given me here. And he said, bring them to me, please, that I may bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. So Joseph brought them near him and kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, I never expected to see your face. And behold, God has let me see your offspring also. And Joseph removed them from his knees and bowed himself with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand towards Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, and Manasseh in his left hand towards Israel's right hand. Sorry, I jumped back a line. Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And so he's sort of doing something like this, reaching out, and very awkward to do, and very strange. Why is he now crossing over his hands? Is it because he's dim of eyes and he thinks, oh, this one over here, he must be the older one, and so I'm going to go over here? And what exactly is going on? It continues, verse 15, and he blessed Joseph. So he's got the two hands on the boys, but he says, it blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys. And in them let my name be carried on, in the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. Here again, Abrahamic covenant language as he's blessing Joseph through the two boys. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. Why is that? Well, because Manasseh is the older one. So Manasseh should be getting this blessing of the right hand and not the left hand. And so Joseph sees this and it displeases him, and he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, not this way, my father, since this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them on that day, saying, by you Israel will pronounce blessings, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. Then he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Now, if you'll recall, when we were going through what are the names of all the sons of Israel, including Ephraim and Manasseh, what do their names mean? Manasseh means he's caused me to forget. And in the context, Joseph names his son this to say, God has caused me to forget all the misery and all the suffering and all the afflictions that I have faced, even from my family back in Canaan. And he has a second son, which he names Ephraim, which means fruitful, or in often many cases, double fruitful. And the text here is giving a little bit of a pun on Ephraim's name, because Ephraim is getting the firstborn blessing, meaning he's getting a double portion, a double fruitfulness of it. When it says earlier, his offspring shall become a multitude of nations. Verse 21, then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you, and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you, rather than to your brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. And so by this whole chapter, it seems like, well, the firstborn blessing goes to Joseph. The language that's being used, he's the one that goes in there first. It's passed on firstly to Ephraim and then to Manasseh. And so that seems to answer the question, does it not? Who's the one that gets the blessing? Well, it's Joseph. But when you continue in chapter 49, The text doesn't stop in 48, but continues right on. It says, "Then Jacob called his sons and said, 'Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you what shall happen to you in days to come.'" Now he's speaking about how he's going to die and what's going to take place, meaning, in one sense, who's going to rule over the family? Who's going to be the one who receives the firstborn blessing? Who's the one who's going to get this birthright? Verse 2, "Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel your father. Reuben, you are my firstborn." And so right off the bat, Reuben, you are, as they would say, the primogenitor, the one who will get this blessing, who has the rights of the firstborn. Reuben, that's you. "My might and the firstfruits of my strength, preeminence in dignity and preeminence in power." Very high praise. You're almost expecting, maybe it is Reuben that's going to get the blessing. But in verse 4 it says, "Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence." So though you're preeminence in dignity and preeminence in power because you're my firstborn, you're not going to have preeminence because you went up to your father's bed. Then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. This verse is a reference, or what he says is a reference back to what we find in Genesis 35. After the birth of Benjamin, we have in verse 22, it says, "When Israel lived in the land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it." It's just this seemingly strange interjection into this text which recounts all the sons of Israel. But it is a very important text because here, when it comes to the time to give the blessing, Jacob says to his actual firstborn son, "Reuben, you ain't getting it because you defiled my bed." We turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 5. We're just going to look at verse 1. It says, "The sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel." And speaking of his genealogy, "For he was the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's couch, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the sons of Israel, so that he could not be enrolled as the oldest son." And so Chronicles notes when it's giving the genealogies of the sons of Israel, he says, Reuben, though he was the firstborn, though he's the one that really should have this preeminence, he did not get it because he defiled his father's bed, and therefore his father has rejected him from being the firstborn. And so it was given to Joseph, as we saw in chapter 48, which then again goes back to that opening question, who gets the blessing, who gets the birthright? Well, doesn't that answer our question? Well, mostly, but not entirely. So if we're following along in 49, you have Reuben as the firstborn. Well, then you have Simeon, who is the secondborn, and Levi following that. And then you would, I guess, assume at that point, well, if it's not Reuben, then it's probably one of those two, if you're going in actual birth order. In verse 5, it says, "Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul not come into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company, for in their anger they killed men, and in their willingness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." Again, not very praiseworthy words given to Simeon and Levi, and so now they are passed over for the blessing as well, because of their violence, because of their anger, and because of how they slaughtered men and how they were cruel, and so Jacob passes over them. Now, as we're going through these stories, I intentionally skipped chapter 34. So you want to turn back there. I intentionally skipped it for this very occasion. Chapter 34 details the reason why Simeon and Levi are rejected by their father from the blessing, from the birthright. This story is interjected into the text. It does not match along with the chronology that is here, but it is put here for a specific reason, which works in a poetic structure, in a chiasm, paralleled with the story of Judah and Tamar, which we'll get to in a little bit. But the purpose of this story is to say why the firstborn blessing did not go on to Simeon and Levi. There are people who debate, well, why is this passage here? It doesn't make any sense. But if you're following the theme of who gets the blessing, it has been going through Genesis all the way back to Abraham. Who's going to get it? Is it Ishmael or is it Isaac? Is it Esau? Is it Jacob? And now which one of the sons of Jacob are going to get it? Chapter 34 gives us a little bit of insight into that. It says, Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the women of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and lay with her and humiliated her. And his soul was drawn to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, Get this girl for my wife. Now Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah, but his sons were with the livestock in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came. Remember, at this point, Jacob is quite old. He's got his sons, and he didn't get married until the good old age of a little over 75, and so he's pretty old here. And so he holds his peace until they came. Verse 6, And Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. And the sons of Jacob had come from the field as soon as they heard of it. And the men were indignant and very angry, because he had done an outrageous thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing must not be done. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, The soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him to be his wife. Make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. You shall dwell with us, and the land shall be open to you. Dwell and trade in it, and get property in it. Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, Let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me, I will give. Ask me for as great a bride price as a gift as you will, and I will give whatever you say to me, only give me the young woman to be my wife. And so the proposal of Hamor and Shechem to Jacob and to the sons of Jacob is, let's all just join together and we can own the land together. Now, that's problematic considering that they really don't need to have this marriage and this intermarriage with Shechem and all the people that he rules over, because the land has already been given to them by God, though they currently do not possess it. But that's the offer put before them. In essence, it's an offer of peace. Let's not have war between us. Let's not have any fighting, but let's just come together in peace. Verse 13, the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully, because he had defiled their sister Dinah. They said to them, We cannot do this thing or give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. Only on this condition will we agree with you, that you will become as we are, by every male among you being circumcised. Then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to ourselves. And we will dwell with you and become one people. And if you will not listen to us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter, and we will be gone. So the proposal given is, sure, we're going to do this, but every male that is in your camp, in your cities where you live, must be circumcised. Circumcision was the covenant given to Abraham, and so if that sort of thing was well known among the people in that area, these are the circumcised children of Abraham, whether or not that's true or not, it's the reason why they're putting this forward. They're saying, well, we can't be intermingled with you because you're not circumcised, and therefore it would be an even greater defilement to us. And so they say, go and be circumcised, but if not, then we're just going to keep Dinah. Verse 18, their words pleased Hamor and Hamor's son Shechem. I'm not sure why. I guess his son is in love with her, and so love, I guess, makes you do strange things. But the words were pleasing to them. And the young man did not delay to do the thing because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. Now he was the most honored of all his father's house. So Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of the city and spoke to the men of their city, saying, "These men are at peace with us. Let them dwell in the land and trade in it, for behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters as wives, and let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men agree to dwell with us, to become one people. When every male among us is circumcised, as they are circumcised, will not their livestock, their property, and all their beasts be ours? Only let us agree with them, and they will dwell with us." And all who went out to the gate of his city listened to Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of his city. And so I suppose the words not only pleased Hamor and Shechem, but they pleased everybody, because they all went and were circumcised. In verse 25, it says, "On the third day when they were sore." Now, the reference here is basically, this is the point where you're in so much pain that you can't do anything. The third day is when it's worst, and so when they were sore, the two sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city while it felt secure and killed all the males. They killed Hamor and his son Shechem with the sword and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went away. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city because they had defiled their sister. They took their flocks and their herds and their donkeys and whatever was in the city and in the field, and their wealth and all their little ones and their wives and all that was in the houses they captured and plundered. In essence, what the text is describing is all the males went and did this, and then on the day when it was the worst for them, they just walked right in and there was no fight whatsoever because they couldn't do anything about it. And so this word that was pleasing to them ended up being their demise. And so you would think that, well, maybe because of this deceitfulness and this craftiness, that this has, I guess, caused them to not have to go to any sort of war if they wanted to keep Dinah. They said, no, we're just going to keep her. What's stopping Shechem from coming and destroying Israel and his sons? And so you might think that, well, Jacob, being a rather good deceiver himself, might be proud of his sons. But on the contrary, it says in verse 30, "Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, 'You have brought trouble on me by making me stink to the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My numbers are few. And if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household.' But they said, 'Should he treat our sister like a prostitute?'" And so Jacob's point is, well, when the other nations around and the other cities around hear of this, they're not going to be happy because they likely have these peace treaties with Shechem and his father. And so now they're going to just gather together and they're going to wipe us out. Jacob really shouldn't have this sort of thought because the promised blessing to him means that he won't be wiped out because he will be a great multitude of a nation. But this event, Jacob is not happy with his sons for. And they defend themselves in their case by saying, "Should he treat our sister like a prostitute?" And that's the last that we have of the story, but it is not the conclusion of it, because the conclusion is what we find in Genesis 49 when Jacob says to these two sons, "Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel, or my glory be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willingness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." And so Jacob's remarks to his sons are, "You really just went way too far with all of this and proved yourselves to be men of violence and of wrath. And because of that, he passes over them as well for the right of the firstborn and for the blessing. So again, there's now 3 sons that have been rejected from it. And all indications so far point to, well, it's Joseph that gets it. I mean, even Chronicles noted that the blessing was passed over from Reuben and given to Joseph. And we see here the blessing is also passed over Simeon and Levi. So why am I still going on and saying, well, there's a little bit of confusion here? Well, yes, it's very clear that the blessing went to Jacob, but what's the problem here? Well, let's continue on in verse 8, where it says, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down before you. That's a little bit of strange language, is it not? Was it not Joseph who had the dream that the brothers would bow down before him, which we saw take place? He's second in command over all of Egypt. He is a father to Pharaoh himself. The visions that he saw when he was 17 years old came to fruition decades later, and yet here in Jacob's blessing of Judah, he says, your father's sons shall bow down before you. He goes on and says, Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as a lioness, who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of peoples. Again, very strange language if it is Joseph who gets the birthright. Why is it then that the scepter is not going to depart from Judah? Why is he going to be the one with the ruler's staff? Why is it that his father's sons are going to bow down before him? Continue on in verse 11. It says, binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine, he has washed his garments in wine and his vestures in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine and his teeth whiter than milk. Speaking of how Judah has preeminence over his brothers. And this is where the game of, guess who becomes confusing, because if Joseph is the one who gets the firstborn blessing, which Chronicles notes, which the text in Genesis 48 is pointing out, why is it that when Jacob blesses Judah, he uses the birthright language? Why is it that when he blesses Judah, he in essence says, Judah, you will rule over your brothers, as if you are the firstborn? Did he not just give the blessing to Joseph? Well, the answer is yes. He did. To Joseph and primarily to Ephraim. And so then what is going on here with Judah? Well, if we go back to 1 Chronicles chapter 5, we only read the first verse intentionally, but we'll continue on. Starting again in verse 1, it says, the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel. For he was the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's couch, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph and the sons of Israel. And the son of Israel was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that he could not be enrolled as the oldest son, though Judah became strong among his brothers, and a chief came from him, yet the birthright belonged to Joseph. And so the text in Chronicles notes that, yes, indeed, the birthright went to Joseph, but ultimately the title of rule went to Judah. And we see this continue. Though for a period of time we see that Ephraim and his descendants are the ones who lead, and we have, you could say, rulers in a sense come from Ephraim, like Joshua, the one who led the people into the promised land. He's not the only one, but as time continues on, who becomes king over Israel? Or we could say, what tribe becomes king over Israel? Eventually, it's Judah. And one of his descendants, that being David, to whom this covenant is given, which then is given to his offspring, that being Solomon, but more appropriately, Christ. And so the tribe does not depart from Judah, as Jacob says, but this makes the question of who gets the blessing, who gets the birthright, a little bit confusing, because yes, it is Joseph, but the primary function of rulership is not given to Joseph, it is given to Judah, because Judah proved to be strong among his brothers. And through Judah, the scepter was given, and it did not depart. In Psalm chapter 2, it picks up on this language used here in the blessing. Now, Psalm chapter 1 and Psalm chapter 2 are the introduction to all of the Psalms. And chapter 2 is messianic, specifically speaking of the Davidic covenant. It says, "Why do the nations rage, and the people meditate in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us." Who here is the Lord's anointed? Well, in the context of Psalm 2, it's the Davidic king. But as I said, this is messianic, so it is also primarily speaking of Christ. Verse 4, "He who sits in heaven laughs. The Lord holds them in derision." And sure, they may have all these meditations, all these plots in vain. They may set themselves up against the Lord of all the earth and his anointed, saying, we're going to break free from them and do whatever we want to do. We're going to rule ourselves and not have them over us. And God's response is, ha, good luck with that. Verse 5, "Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree." This being now transitioning into the anointed one. "I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession." Going back to the Lord, that his anointed is to ask of him these things. He continues, "You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way. For his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him." Psalm 2, drawing on the language of the Davidic covenant of this anointed one, literally the Messiah. The word anointed one is the word Messiah in Hebrew. And it's also drawing off of the imagery here in Genesis 49 when it speaks of how the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Saying he's going to rule over everyone. And the sign of his preeminence over everyone will be the fact that they bring tribute to him. Again and again and again. And he will demand that all these peoples be obedient to his rule. And so Judah has the blessing of rule over his brothers. Now there is one other story that we had skipped over. Again, intentionally. Genesis 38, if you turn there. Again, this story is just thrown in at this spot. It is not within the chronology that is proposed, because the end of chapter 37 has Joseph going into Egypt, and chapter 39 begins with Joseph going into Egypt. And so there's no time break between 37 and 39, but then you have this chapter interjected. And again, the commentators and people, when they look at this text, some will say, well, it's kind of just thrown here for no reason, but there is a reason. And it's the same reason as the story of Dinah. It has to do with where the blessing goes and how the blessing is passed on. And the reason why the story of Dinah is put where it is, and the story of Judah and Tamar here in 38 is put, is for this poetic structure that takes place in the book. And so though it breaks the chronology, it's very Hebraic in how it's organized. Chapter 38, verse 1, it says, "It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. And then Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shua. And he took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Judah was in Hezib when she bore him. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. It is a not great reputation to have in the words of Scripture. Judah's firstborn son is a wicked man in the sight of the Lord, and so the Lord said, poof, you're done. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go in to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her and raise up an offspring for your brother." Now this is basically what would later become known as the kinsman redeemer. That's when the older brother, that being the primogenitor, the one who carries on the name of the father, if he dies before having children and he's married, it is then the job of another brother, the one closest in relation to him, to then raise up an offspring for his brother. And so what Judah is saying to Onan is, you go in and you marry Tamar, but the offspring that you have with her is not your son, it is your older brother's son. And so Judah says this to Onan, verse 9, "But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give an offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also." It's not a great start for the sons of Judah, is it? First one's killed because he's wicked. Second one doesn't want to do what he's supposed to do for his brother. And not only that, it's as if he's taking advantage of Tamar, and so God then puts him to death as well. And this raises all sorts of suspicions in Judah's mind. It says, "Then Judah," verse 11, "said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, 'Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up,' for he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house." And so Judah's fear is, if I give my third son, my youngest, my last one, to this woman, he's as good as dead. He's done for. Lord's going to kill him too. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. Well, that provides yet another problem because it doesn't have another son, as far as we know of. So his third son, Shelah, it seems that it's all he's got. And so his wife dies. And when Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira, the Adullamite. And Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." She took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road of Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, She had not been given to him in marriage. And so for all these years, she's been wearing these widows, these mourning garments, and basically that's an expression of saying that she's not going to remarry. By her remaining in those garments, it's saying that I'm not open to being pursued by another man. And the reason she stayed in those is because, well, she's supposed to be waiting for this third son that she's supposed to get. But lo and behold, he's now grown up and they're not married. And so she goes up to Timnah, but she disguises herself. In verse 15, it says, when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had her face covered. And he turned to her at the roadside and said, come, let me come in to you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, what will you give me that you may come in to me? And he answered, I will send you a young goat from the flock. And she said, I will, if you give me a pledge until you send it. And he said, what pledge shall I give you? She said, your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. This is a very high, very costly request. His signet and his staff and his cord. 3 things that are a symbol that you rule a tribe. In chapter 49, it's the what shall not depart from Judah? The staff, the rod. Same wording that's going on here. And so she says, leave your signet, your cord, and your staff here with me as a pledge until you send this goat as payment. Now, this family is continually deceived by goats. Jacob deceived his father with a goat. Judah deceived his father with the death of Joseph with a goat. And now Judah here is deceived by Tamar with a goat. I don't know if the lesson here for us tonight is do not accept goats as a gift, because there's some sort of deception that goes around with that. But that is what he offers to her as payment. It's very ironic. Verse 20, when Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to take back the pledge of the woman's hand, he did not find her. Then he asked the men of the place, where is the cult prostitute who was at Enaim at the roadside? And they said, no cult prostitute has been here. Well, that's not good. So now she has his authority, basically, of rule over his tribe, the symbols of those, and not only is she not there, but apparently she doesn't even exist, according to the men of the city. Verse 22, so he returned to Judah and said, I have not found her. Also the men of the place said, no cult prostitute has been here. And Judah replied, let her keep the things as her own, or we shall be laughed at. You see, I sent this young goat, and you did not find her. About 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral, or more literally, she has committed prostitution. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality, or more literally, by prostitution. And Judah said, bring her out, and let her be burned. This is a very speedy response of Judah, who did not live up to his end of the bargain with Tamar in the first place. But he calls for her to be brought out and be burned. Verse 25, and as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, so to Judah, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. Well, what do you think she is sending to him? Perhaps 3 significant objects to him. And she says, please identify whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. Again, this is drawing off of more language of how Judah deceived his father. He brings the coat to his father that is got the goat's blood all over it, and he says to his father, identify this to see whether or not it's your son's. And the same phrase is used here for her when she says, please identify these 3 things to see whose they are. Then Judah identified them and said, she is more righteous than I, for I did not give her my son Shelah, and you did not know her again. And so Judah recognizes that I didn't uphold my end of the bargain, and I did not give my son to her to raise up an offspring for her brother. And so essentially in the same way as his second-born, Judah has not done what he is supposed to in redeeming the oldest son by giving the youngest son. And so he proclaims that she is more righteous than I. She has acted in a much more just way than I, even with this thing that she has done, because what I have done is far more unjust than her, because I did not give her what she has promised. Verse 27, when the time of her labor came, there were twins in her womb. Yet another thing that runs in this family are twins. And when she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife took it and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But as he drew back his hand, behold, his brother came out. What a strange event. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." Therefore his name was called Perez, which means a breach. And afterward his brother came out with the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. And so you have the one this is going to be the firstborn, so they tie the cord around so you don't get them confused as to which one is the firstborn who should get the firstborn blessing. And it turns out the one that's marked as the firstborn is not the firstborn, because Perez makes a breach and comes out before his brother Zerah. And so you have this story that just takes place in the middle of Joseph's story. And it's, what in the world is going on here, especially since this is not at all within the chronology? Well, it's playing into who is going to get the blessing. Because we see that as the genealogies continue, that it is through Judah that the Davidic line comes, and lo and behold, it is through one of these two sons. Which is it? Well, when we look in the genealogy, Matthew chapter 1. It says, "The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers." It's not Jacob the father of Joseph, whom Jesus came through, but Jacob the father of Joseph and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and it continues on. That this, what you could say, not so great story in the history of the sons of Israel is forever written within the pages of Scripture, not just one account, but on many accounts, even to the point that the anointed one, the one who would ultimately have the scepter of Judah, would come through one of these two children by Tamar, that being Perez. This is not the only one that is named here. There's a little bit of a side, but as the genealogy continues, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nashon, and Nashon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab. And there is another, what you might say, not great story, but it is a great story. But Rahab, being this foreigner who is in Jericho, this place that was condemned, and she was saved by this scarlet thread that she tied out her window. And yet, through her faith, we see that she is a part of the Davidic line, through whom the Messiah would come. So it's not just Tamar who is mentioned, but also Rahab by Boaz, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse. And so then you also have Ruth being another foreigner, she being a Moabite, but professed faith in God. And so now she too is in this Davidic line, because by Ruth and you have Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king, as it continues and goes to Jesus, who is the Christ, Christ being the Greek word for Messiah. And so you have these stories inserted into Genesis, and the point that they are there is to say who gets the blessing. Who does it get passed through? The first story with Dinah is to say Simeon and Levi are passed over. Reuben was passed over because he defiled his father's bed. And so this rule then goes on to Judah. And you have the story of Judah and Tamar to say here is how the line continued on through Judah by Tamar and Perez. And so Judah is going to be the one who rules. And from him comes David, and from David comes Christ. And the same blessing that's given here to Judah, very similar language in many places is used to speak of Christ. We already noted in verse 10 about the scepter and the ruler's staff, the imagery in Psalm chapter 2. But as well, in verse 10 it says, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. We're going to close with Zechariah chapter 14. If you were here this morning, you might think I'm obsessed with Zechariah chapter 14. I did not plan for this chapter to be in my sermon this morning and in my sermon this evening. I mean, I did not do it intentionally, but it's kind of difficult to get around it for both of these texts. We talked about this morning how Christ's ascension gives us evidence and assurance that Christ will return. And on the day when Christ returns, in verse 4, we read that on that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and on the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward and the other half southward. It's drawing images of salvation like the Red Sea, where Israel passed through to their salvation. Also images of the Jordan River being parted in two in the days of Joshua when they entered the Promised Land. And so too when Christ descends on the Mount of Olives, it splits and it opens up this valley for Israel to come in from their hiding in the land of Bozrah, and they will walk through this mountain up to the temple with Christ their leader. And that's what the events are describing here, is this Christ in his second coming will bring judgment upon the nations. And he will bring this peace, and he will gather his people. Verse 13, when it's talking about how this is going to take place, it says, on that day a great panic from the Lord shall fall on them, so that each will seize the hand of another, and the hand of one will be raised against the hand of the other. This is very much similar language used in the conquest of Canaan, that when Israel went to fight against the nations, God says, you're going to fight, but it is me who is going to drive out the nations. And we see God bring confusion to Israel's enemies, so much so that the nations spend more time killing themselves in the war than Israel spends killing them. Such is in the case of Gideon, for example. And he describes the very same confusion here that's going to happen on that day. Verse 14, even Judah will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be collected, gold, silver, and garments in great abundance. And a plague like this plague shall fall on the horses, the mules, the camels, the donkeys, whatever beasts may be in those camps. Then everyone who survives of all the nations, so everybody who doesn't die in this great plague and Christ coming and destroying the nations, the ones who survive of all the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the feast of booths. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. And if the family of Egypt does not go up and present themselves, then on them there shall be no rain. And he chooses Egypt specifically because, as we've talked about in Genesis, it's very rare for Egypt to have a plague, a famine so great that they cannot have food. And so Egypt is the pinnacle that even if Egypt doesn't come up, Egypt will have this plague and they will have no food because they will have no rain and they will have a great famine. There shall be the plague with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up to keep the feast of booths. This shall be the punishment to Egypt and the punishment to all the nations that do not go up to keep the feasts of booths. And on that day there shall be inscribed on the bells of horses holy to the Lord. And the pots in the house of the Lord shall be as the bowls before the altar. And every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holy to the Lord of hosts, so that all who sacrifice may come and take of them, and boil the meat of the sacrifice in them. There shall no longer be a traitor in the house of the Lord of hosts that day. This conclusion here that to Zechariah's book, speaking of Christ's second coming, he says that when Christ has put the nations into submission underneath him, what is going to be required of the nations? That they go up year by year to the Feast of Booths. And what this is speaking of is they are going to bring him tribute year after year after year. And if a nation refused to bring tribute to Jesus sitting on the throne in Jerusalem, if a nation refuses to go up and keep the Feast of Booths, there's going to be a plague upon them. There's going to be no rain. And so this imagery used back in Genesis 39 about how the scepter is not going to depart from Judah, and to him tribute will be brought, and how the peoples will be in obedience to him, is ultimately speaking of Christ. And this is just one passage here in Zechariah. Isaiah speaks about tribute being brought to him. It speaks about him ruling. Ezekiel speaks of it. Jeremiah speaks of it. In fact, almost all the prophets speak of this event taking place, that this Davidic king, the one from the line of David, the one from the line of Judah, would rule. And so, yes, Joseph is one who gets the blessing. I mean, he is the favorite son. He is the son of Jacob's old age. He is also Jacob's long-lost son, so that adds even more into his favor. And so the blessing goes upon Jacob, or from Jacob to Joseph to Ephraim. But ultimately, we see that Judah is the one who's going to rule. And Jesus did not come through Joseph, through Ephraim, but he comes through Judah. And that was prophesied all the way back in Genesis 49. And we see that God's blessings in Genesis 49, his promises to Judah, came to fruition because David was king of the line of Judah, even though Saul was not of the line of Judah. But the kingdom was taken away from Saul and given to a man after God's own heart, that being David, and a man even more so after God's own heart, that being the Messiah. And so just as God made good on his promises to Judah through David and ultimately through Christ, his first coming, we can have that assurance and certainty that the events described here in Zechariah 14, and that this scepter never departing from Judah, the tribute will be brought to this anointed one, that he will rule over the nations with a rod of iron, and they will be put into submission under his feet forever, will come to pass, just as everything else so far has come to pass. Let's pray. Gracious Lord, I thank you for these stories of Jacob and his sons that we've been looking at in Genesis. And Lord, as we've seen over the past several months, this family is not an ideal family. This family is not a family that one would think to choose as one whom a mighty nation, a line through whom you yourself would come and bring salvation. And Lord, despite all their flaws, Lord, you are gracious unto them. And Lord, we also recognize that they are described as a people of faith. Lord, I pray that the lessons that we have learned from Jacob and his sons would speak to our hearts, Lord, because we are by no means perfect. Lord, by no means are we functional as a perfect family, as sinless, but Lord, many occasions we are just as dysfunctional as Jacob and his sons. And Lord, you are gracious to us. Lord, I thank you that the blessings that you have given to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Joseph, and to Judah, and to the other sons. And Lord, that through that nation our salvation came. Lord, I pray that we would rest and have assurance in our salvation, knowing that you are coming again. Lord, that just as you ascended, you will also descend, and you will gather all your people to yourselves. Lord, we who have loved your coming will receive our glorified body like yours. Lord, I pray that we would be faithful to go out from here and proclaim this blessing, this gospel message to others who do not believe, who do not have faith. In Jesus' name, amen.